Good afternoon, guys. There's the latest article by Dan Christensen from the Florida Bulldog regarding the recent uh, civil suit case of the 9/11 victims' families, in which they're led by Creedler and Motley Rice, civil suit against the Saudi kingdom for their alleged role in the 9/11 attacks, and it's coming to a close. And what I'm going to do is we're going to pull up the article and we're going to read it together, actually. And we'll see what's left of this case and why this is really important, because it's going to be up to the Southern District of New York, led by Judge George Daniels, to make a decision of whether to expand this case or to close it. And what we're going to do is going to read the article together. 7 years after thousands of 9/11 family victims won the right to sue Saudi Arabia for allegedly helping al-Qaeda hijackers attack the United States, their monumental court case is approaching a make or break crossroads. I think what I'm going to do is just expand on this just a little bit so you could see. The kingdom's Washington, D.C. lawyers recently declared in court documents that by October 6th, they will ask the presiding federal judge to dismiss the New York litigation against them in its entirety, asserting that a U.S. court lacks jurisdiction to hear the multi-billion-dollar case against Saudi Arabia and is immune from a lawsuit under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. The senior U.S. District Judge George Daniels agrees the decades-old case against Saudi Arabia would stop dead in its tracks, though appeals would likely drag on for years. I don't think there's a lot of understanding out there that if the motion to dismiss is granted, the case is, for all intents and purposes, over, said Christian Breitweiser, whose husband Ron died in the collapse of the World Trade Center South Tower. We end up losing this case. Literally, there will be no accountability or justice whatsoever for 3,000 innocent civilians who were brutally murdered in broad daylight more than 2 decades ago. That's just outrageous. It's something I expect in some third world theocratic country, not the United States of America, she said. Unfortunately, we're allied to this country because we are one of the main exporters of oil. And we also have a long-standing relationship in that we also sell more weapons to Saudi Arabia than any country on earth. And I think this is a problem in the long run, because if we don't want to unsettle or offend these theocrats, which is what they are, Wahhabi theocrats, well, we're going to have to protect them from a civil case like this. Breitweiser is just one of the 4 Jersey girls who lost their husbands on 9/11 and were later indispensable in the lobbying effort to convince Congress and a reluctant President George W. Bush to establish the 9/11 Commission to investigate the 2001 terrorist attacks. The other widows in the group were Patty Kazaza, Mindy Kleinberg, and Lori Van Auken. It's not so easy to win. That was just shown in Pensacola, Breitweiser said. She referred to a May ruling by a federal magistrate in North Florida that the families of 3 murdered U.S. Navy servicemen cannot sue Saudi Arabia for damages after a Saudi Air Force officer with significant ties to al-Qaeda opened fire on them and others at Able Air Force Station, Pensacola, in 2019. I did a video on that, which is ridiculous, because here you have a smaller case, and it's a great example as to what you think is going to happen in this case. U.S. District Judge Casey Rogers, who will make the final call on whether FISA or FSIA, which is the foreign The FSIA. What is that again? I keep mixing that up with FISA. Um, well, anyway, the Foreign something Act was correctly invoked, has given plaintiffs' lawyers until Monday, June 26th, to file objections to the magistrate's recommendation. However, should George Daniels in New York find the plaintiffs have produced enough facts to overcome the kingdom's renewed assertions of sovereign immunity, as Congress enabled in certain circumstances in 2016 with the passage of the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, that's JASTA, the case would not only continue, but expand greatly in scope. That's what we need. So, in other words, we need Daniels to actually look at the case and basically eliminate the foreign sovereign immunity. That's what FSIA meant, the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act from Saudi Arabia. And then we could look into Arizona, Florida, and other states that the hijackers are in. To date, Daniels has limited discovery or fact-finding to events surrounding the entry into the United States of the first two al-Qaeda hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar, via Los Angeles in January 2000, and the help they received after they arrived. The two men were later aboard American Airlines Flight 77 when it crashed in the Pentagon. But should the case be allowed to continue, the plaintiffs would then be allowed to examine what the 19 hijackers were up to in other locals, including South and Southwest Florida, Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona, Falls Church, Virginia, and Patterson, New Jersey. That's right. Once we meet the prima facie showing of jurisdiction of Saudi Arabia, we then proceed to discovery on the merits as to issues on all al-Qaeda cells, their support systems, and on Saudi Arabia's systematic material support of violent extremism, said plaintiff's attorney Jody Westbrook Flowers of the South Carolina-based law firm Motley Rice. Judge Daniels restricted discovery in a 2018 order that denied a previous Saudi motion to dismiss. In it, he declared the plaintiffs had articulated a reasonable basis for Saudi Arabia to be held responsible for the conduct of two of its agents who aided al-Hazmi al-Mihdhar, suspected spy Omar al-Bayoumi, and diplomat Fahad al-Dumeri, and their sub-agents. Further, the judge ruled the 9/11 victims' alleged facts sufficient to show that al-Bayoumi and al-Dumeri, both Saudi nationals, were following instructions from more senior officials in the Saudi embassy. But they were. They were, because in the Operation Encore files, which I've been following extensively and still reading many of the 18,000 pages, you had a Saudi Islamic Affairs attaché, Muassad al-Jarrah, who actually gave Fahad al-Dumeri his imam position at the King Fahd Mosque in Los Angeles, and was in close and constant contact with Omar al-Bayoumi. And this is coming from the FBI's own investigation into the two men and others in the Culver City, Los Angeles area, where Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar commiserated. Daniels noted that shortly after the hijackers' arrival, al-Bayoumi met for an hour with Dumeri's office at the Saudi Arabian consulate before meeting al-Hazmi and al-Mihdhar in a nearby Middle Eastern restaurant where he offered to help the pair settle in San Diego. That's coming from the testimony of Kaysan bin Don, who's an associate of Omar al-Bayoumi, who was with him when al-Bayoumi met al-Hazmi al-Mihdhar at the Mediterranean Cafe. That's in the Pent Bomb investigation. That's in the Operation Encore files investigation. Al-Bayoumi assisted the two al-Qaeda members, neither of whom could speak English, by finding them an apartment, co-signing their lease as a guarantor, helping them open a bank account, occasionally paying their rent, and most significantly, putting them in touch with Anwar al-Awlaki, an imam and covert al-Qaeda recruiter, who a decade later would be killed in a U.S. drone strike in Yemen. Now, the FBI interviewed members of the King Fahd Mosque and also members of the Al-Ribiat, San Diego, and asked them, the congregants, Has Omar al-Bayoumi ever done this with any other foreign Arab student coming to this country? And all of them said no. This is the only time where Omar al-Bayoumi actually went out of his way and provided logistical and financial support to two foreign Arab nationals, in which he denied initially to the FBI in the pen bomb investigation. But he can't deny it now. On that basis, Daniels granted lawyers for 9/11 victims the authority to conduct limited and targeted discovery aimed at answering the question whether and to what extent Thumeri, Bayoumi, and their agents took actions in 2000 at the direction of more senior Saudi officials to provide assistance to al-Hazmi, al-Midar, and other 9/11 hijackers. Since then, much more has come out about the roles of al-Bayoumi, Thumeri, and their mysterious superiors at the Saudi embassy and what happened in Southern California. It all starts with Muassad al-Jarrah. Some of that information is contained in still sealed records turned over to plaintiffs' lawyers by the United States, the Saudi government, and in depositions taken from dozens of witnesses, both here and in the Middle East. Those records are secret under the terms of a protective order imposed by the court to shield allegedly important national security matters, thanks to William Barr, under the Trump administration, in which Trump even promised to the 9/11 victims' families in the Creedle and Motley Rice litigation cases that he would cooperate and release these files. But William Barr said no and invoked state secrets. More emerged publicly after the Department of Justice disclosure of the existence of the FBI's Operation Encore to Florida Bulldog in 2016 amid Freedom of Information Act litigation. Encore, apparently frowned on by FBI higher-ups, was an investigation into alleged Saudi government complicity in 9/11. Encore, known in FBI bureaucrats as a sub-file probe of Pent Bomb, the code name for its primary 9/11 investigation, was so highly classified that even its name was redacted from the 2012 FBI report that was released to Florida Bulldog. Adding to the mystery was Trump's administration Attorney General William Barr's invoking in 2020 of the state's secret privilege to broadly block the release of FBI documents about Encore that we now know contain evidence that Saudi government officials knowingly provided a support network for al-Hazmi and al-Midar. As you could see, this all started with Bush, and then it translated over to Obama, and then it translated over to Trump. But the pressure is getting too much. And so Biden released some of the files relating to the FBI investigation into al-Hazmi and al-Midar and to the other 9/11 hijackers with Saudi support in Operation Encore by releasing those files. I wonder what else they didn't release. Barr's extraordinary effort to hide documents evincing Saudi complicity. The FBI's repeated solidarity with Saudi Arabia in court proceedings to suppress information about events leading up to 9/11 and the refusal the National Security Agency and other U.S. intelligence agencies to offer up 9/11 evidence has caused bitterness among survivors and the families of the dead because the NSA would have the most information. They were listening to the phone calls of bin Laden and the al-Qaeda communications hub in Yemen, and Lord knows what they were listening to. Also, at the same time, the CIA hasn't been cooperative because they knew that al-Midar and al-Hazmi entered the United States, didn't share that information with the FBI initially, which they should have. And here you have a cover-up after the fact of 9/11 by the FBI, pressured strictly from the White House. Don't upset our allies. And as you could see, they favor a corrupt regime in Saudi Arabia over its own citizens. So why do you vote? The FBI, CIA, NSA's 9/11 Saudi cover-up skullduggery spanning over 20 years, including the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, equates to complicity after the fact, said Sharon Premeley, a Vermont resident who was at work on the 80th floor of the World Trade Center's North Tower when the first plane struck. She felt the building lurch and sway, then with a group of others made to the ground where she was seriously injured upon the collapse of the South Tower. The 9/11 families and survivors have seen it all, even in court, and there's plenty of anger to go around. The FBI evidence is unambiguous. 9/11 would have never have happened without Saudi Arabia, Premeley said, quoting former Senator Bob Graham, who co-chaired Congress's joint inquiry into 9/11. Said Christian Breitweiser, the U.S. government has not been cooperative, has not shared evidence and information. A lot of my grievances are with the so-called Department of Justice. They protect the terrorists rather than prosecuting them and helping victims. I interviewed Ken Williams, who authored the Phoenix memo out of Phoenix, Arizona, from the FBI on the Darkened Hour podcast. And he told me, too, that the FBI told him not to help the victims' families in their case against Saudi Arabia. Initially, he listened, but then he changed his mind and then helped Creedland. Can you imagine that? New evidence has emerged recently thanks to President Biden's September 2021 executive order directing the Attorney General and the heads of other executive departments and agencies that originated relevant information about 9/11 to complete declassification reviews and make public records that truly don't involve national security. Information should not remain classified when the public interest in disclosure outweighs any damage to the national security, the order says. In the months that followed, the FBI released thousands of pages of previously buried records, including many Operation Encore documents that convincingly support the case for Saudi government involvement that 9/11 victims have striven for years to lay out in a court of law. Yes, it did, because I have the videos to show you what I did the read-along to Operation Encore files that show that there was an Islamic military attaché, Muhammad al-Jarrah, providing logistical support to Saudi agents like Omar al-Bayoumi and Fahad al-Tamari to provide that assistance to Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. And there's a lot more to go with it because Muhammad al-Jarrah is also a supporter of extremism, Salafi extremism, and implemented Salafi extremists like Fahad al-Tamari in the King Fahd Mosque as a team up. Notably, that includes a 130-page FBI compendium report written in July 2021, spelling out the numerous connections of U.S.-based personnel and entities controlled by the Saudi Arabian government to the terrorist attacks September 11, 2001. For example, Omar al-Bayoumi is affirmatively identified in the 2021 FBI report as a paid co-optee of the kingdom's primary intelligence agency, the Saudi General Intelligence Presidency, via then Ambassador Prince Bandar bin Sultan Al Saud, who's nicknamed Bandar Bush because he's close friends with the Bush family. Bayoumi and Tumeri, who in addition to being an unaccredited diplomat, was an imam at the nearby King Fahd Mosque, who also identified in the 2012 FBI report as having been tasked with aiding the future hijackers by the Saudi embassy's then director of Islamic Affairs, Muhammad al-Jarrah. That's him right here. The Encore probe was begun 3 years after the 9/11 Commission shut down in 2004. It had declared Saudi Arabia has long been considered the primary source of al-Qaeda's funding, but we have found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded the organization. Since then, the kingdom has cited that sentence to contend it was clear of involvement in 9/11 terrorist attacks. But former Senator Bob Graham, as well as other 9/11 Commission members, including Bob Kerry and John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy under President Ronald Reagan, have each rebuffed that assertion, stating publicly that the Saudi government was not exonerated. For Christian Breitweiser, Sharon Premley, and thousands of other plaintiffs watching from the sidelines as the massive New York civil suit inches forward, anxiety is rising again as they await yet another crucial test of their case against Saudi Arabia. I would much rather have a bunch of U.S. attorneys with the full power of the United States standing behind them prosecuting co-conspirators. But my country decided not to do that. So what am I left with? I'm left with the 9/11 litigation, which is a civil federal court action, but at the end of the day is a murder trial for 3,000 people, said Christian Breitweiser. That's the end of the article. Much thanks to Dan Christensen of the Florida Bulldog. I'll link it in the description. And we have 3.5 months before they make the decision. Either they'll expand on the case and release the Foreign Immunities Act, which is shielding Saudi Arabia from this litigation, or Daniels ends the case. And the only case that's left is, of course, the looming paralyzed trial in Guantanamo, which most likely is not going to trial. And once again, the victims' families will be denied justice. And that's why we need more voices speaking out in support of these people. See you in the next video. Catch you later.